a Living History production.
This is the Living History Podcast, broadcasting live across the airwaves.
Hello everyone, welcome to Living History, and today we are talking Australian films, but not the latest blockbusters. We are going back in time to one of the original Australian films, The Sentimental Bloke. It was first released in 1919, and 100 years later it's had a whole new lease of life thanks to the National Film and Sound Archives. That's where I am at the moment. I'm in the National Film and Sound Archives in Sydney, and joining me to talk about The Sentimental Bloke is Elena Guest. Thank you for joining us on the show.
Really happy to be here, Matt. Thank you.
So, tell us about The Sentimental Bloke. It's an iconic movie from the earliest days of Australian cinema. Just give us a little bit of history. Paint the picture for what this movie was all about.
Yeah, so as you say, it was actually released in 1919. The initial screening of it actually happened in 1918 in Adelaide, and then commercially released in Australia in 1919. So it's one of our earliest silent feature films, directed by Raymond Longford, and co-produced, co-written by Lottie Lyle, who was his partner in life as well as in filmmaking. They were a bit of a powerhouse duo at the time in Australian film. The film has a bit of a checkered history. It was originally a nitrate print. I don't know if you know about nitrate. It's very volatile.
Tell us about that. Yeah.
It's a very volatile medium, and if it catches fire, end of story for everything, really. So we have specific nitrate vaults in Canberra that we store nitrate film in. Initially, the film was with the National Library of Australia, before the archive actually existed. And after a series of fires down there, the print was rescued and saved, but was missing a reel. So when the film was made, it was a box office hit in Australia, but it was also released in the US under a different name, completely edited. A lot of strine in the intertitles taken out because the US audience wouldn't understand it. But the film itself was based on the songs of a Sentimental Bloke, which was written by C.J. Dennis in 1915. And that was a hit at the time as well when that was released, that poetry. So they made it into a film. It was released in Australia by E.J. Carroll, who went on to, he's Queensland-based at the time, went on to become Birch Carroll Coyle, I think, in Queensland, and released by Southern Cross Films in Australia. Raymond Longford and Lottie Lyle, as I said, wrote and produced it. It was shot in and around Sydney. It was initially in the script for Melbourne, but they decided to shoot it in Sydney. So there's a lot of historic and vintage footage of, say, Central Station before the clock tower was built, and the trams where they are now, also back then. Woolloomooloo, there's a scene where he's coming out of jail, which is the old Darlinghurst jail. Botanic Gardens, they shot illegally in the Botanic Gardens at the time. They didn't get permits. So it's very Sydney-centric and of its time. It's the story of the Sentimental Bloke, Bill, played by Arthur. I'm never sure how to say his surname. I've heard it said so many different ways. I think it's Tau Chair, whose grave is actually in the Waverley Cemetery, I discovered the other week. And the story of him and his love interest, Doreen, played by Lottie Lyle. He's a bit of a larrikin. That's a word that's commonly used with the Sentimental Bloke. There's a bit of biffo involved, a bit of drinking, a bit of gambling. And his love for Doreen puts him back on the straight and narrow, but it's not an easy path to romantic success. So it's also a bit of a Romeo-Juliet story, but it's not without its comedic elements. So it's also a bit of a rom-com as well. And he has his mate Ginger Mick, played by Gilbert Emery in the film, who is a bit of a scallywag himself and so he's got Doreen on one side steering him to the path of happily married life, and on the other side he's got Ginger Mick pulling him away into the realms of two-up and pubs.
Tell us about the Australian film industry at this time, because we're talking right at the end of the First World War. You wouldn't think people were too distracted by the cinema at this time with everything going on. How many movies were being made? Was Australia producing a lot of content at this time?
Yeah, look, it was quite prolific. And E.J. Carroll at the time was actually producing films as well. So Raymond Longford went on to make another 2 films around the I guess you'd call it a trilogy around that bloke sort of theme, including a sequel with Ginger Mick from the Sentimental Bloke. So we saw films like On Our Selection coming out around that time. There was a different sort of sense about women, I think, in film at that time. So Lottie Lyle wasn't actually credited for a lot of the work that she did in those films. But we also saw films like The Squatter's Daughter come out. So it was quite a prolific time for films. But the interesting thing about The Bloke is that it's the only surviving full-length feature from that time.
So these movies were being shown in cinemas, silent movies with, as you say, the title screens in between with the dialogue, because obviously they're silent films with no sound. Was this the sort of thing with live music playing alongside as well?
Yeah, that's right.
It must have been quite an experience for people to, particularly in wartime, for people to take a break from the horrors of what they were reading in the newspaper to go out and have a night out with the family at the pictures.
I think that's right. And I think history, you would know as well, that in times of war, entertainment is a really valuable part of the economy. And people do tend to want to have some relief if they've got the money to spend to go to the movies or go and see a show or whatever. So, and even in The Bloke, you'll see there's a big banner on Central Station about war bonds, and so it is of a specific time. But yes, I think that's right about wartime.
So the movie was a commercial hit in Australia,
Yep.
but it had less success with the attempt to transition it to the American market, didn't it? Tell us a little bit more about that.
It worked well in the UK, is my understanding, and the reviews were supportive, and people thought it was a fine piece of cinema. In the US, it was a different story. They shortened it. They thought it was too long. They moved scenes around in it because they thought our narrative style wasn't working for their audience. They gave it a different title, and they changed all the intertitles into American English rather than the Strine.
Was it actually ever released in America? How did
Yes,
it do
it was.
in the
It
American
didn't
market?
do anything. It was no good.
So it was not a success
No,
in America?
not a success. So mainly just Australia and the UK.
Okay. Where did Australia sit in the hierarchy of movie making at this time? Because Hollywood was already well established, and was it considered that Australia was making good quality pictures that were making a contribution to the film world?
Yeah, look, I'm not really sure about how many Australian films were released overseas, in the US in particular. I know a lot of our films went back to the UK, obviously, because of our ties to the UK. But as far as the US box office is concerned, I'm not really sure about.
I think that's reflective of the fact that Australian movies weren't doing a lot in America, I can imagine, at the time.
Potentially like our Australian actors are doing now.
So we've got this wonderful picture, but then it fell off the radar a bit, really. Well, I mean, it's a century ago that this film came out. Silent movies have disappeared. Why are we now talking about this movie again in 2020?
So there's been several reconstructions of the film along the way. Initially, Tony Buckley, who's a well-known Australian producer, respliced the original film in the 50s, and it was screened at the Sydney Film Festival in, I think, 1955 from memory, to great response. So it still had an audience then, as we hope it still does now as well. There was another iteration of it. So the thing about nitrate is that you couldn't duplicate the prints, the nitrate outcome, unless you had two cameras filming side by side. Whereas as we move along and the technology has shifted, we can now duplicate prints and make dupe negatives and everything else. So the archive, the National Film and Sound Archive, has multiple components for all the films, pretty much, that we hold in the collection that are complete. In the 1990s, there was the opportunity for the National Film and Sound Archive to screen a film at the Pordenone Silent Film Festival, which is the major one internationally, and they looked at how they could duplicate The Sentimental Bloke to screen it at that festival, and the tints and tones as well in the film. So given the technology at the time, the tints and tones were food colouring, and that was that process that began in the 90s continued into the early 2000s, where in 2004 a full reconstruction, photochemical reconstruction happened of the film with AtLab Deluxe, and there were several people in the archive that partnered with them to produce that film, which premiered again at the Sydney Film Festival in 2004 to a full house with live accompaniment by Jen Anderson and the Larrikins. But that process was all photochemical with acetate outcomes. We're now in a digital age. So the technology has shifted again, And the majority of cinemas these days do not screen 35mm prints. It's all a digital cinema package, a DCP. So now we're at the stage where if we want that film to have a life beyond 35mm, we've also got a 16mm print as well in the national, the non-theatrical lending collection. But to have a life beyond what it's had to date, we now have to do digital restorations, and that's the intent of the NFSA Restores program, is to bring in the original components or whatever we have, to scan those, to grade them, to clean them digitally. It's a 4K scan. And then we have digital outcomes as well that we can use into the future.
It must be quite a challenge for the archives, this constant updating of technology, because you mentioned in that excellent explanation several times over the decades there's been a shift in technology, which has meant that the work that had been done before now needed to be updated and you needed a new version of the film. That must be a constant challenge for everything you're doing, to preserve these old archival materials but still have them accessible for people as technology evolves.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the main objectives of most of the cultural sector that have collections at the moment, is to digitise the collections that they've got, to make sure that we're keeping up with technology, to make sure that it's accessible, but also to preserve it into the future. And as you suggest, that technology changes all the time. So even within cinema exhibition, the ways of screening cinema back in 2009, we were talking about earlier, it was a much lower quality file and not so encrypted as they are now with the DCPs coming from Hollywood to protect from piracy. So even in the last 10 years, the technology within cinemas has changed completely. You may have seen there was an article about the demise of the projectionist now, because it's all automated. And I understand that soon, there'll be the potential for films to actually come down the pipe. So you won't even be shipping around drives or anything anymore. All the cinemas will be connected, hopefully, by broadband, and it will all just be automated from a
live streaming to the cinemas. That's amazing.
Yeah, central operating unit.
So let's talk about this film specifically, because I've seen the new and improved version, and it's quite extraordinary. And you also showed me a wonderful file which compared the original to the enhanced version that we're going to see now. Just extraordinary, the difference. When I was watching it, I actually had this strange sort of feeling. When people try to recreate old black and white films, they never look authentic because the quality is too high. That was almost the feeling I had. I had to keep saying to myself, you are watching an original century-old film, because the enhancement is absolutely extraordinary.
That's very interesting, that comment, because part of the restoration process for us is restoring it to its original, to how it looked when it was first released. So we're not interested in fixing things up. We're not interested in sharpening out of focus sequences or shots. It has to be as close to the original as possible. So in some instances, if there's subtitles, we have to match the font. With this, we were lucky enough that we could scan the material we had in the vault here. Plus, we got a copy of the US version from George Eastman Museum in New York, in Rochester. They did a very high-quality 4K scan of their master element, fine-grained master element, out of their vaults over there. And we've had to put those two components together to this final project. So you will see discrepancies. They're very slight between the two source components, but they are still visible. But we're very conscious that we don't push it too far. I have seen some 4K restorations from international sources that, as you say, they're quite hard and do look a bit video-y, and we try not to push it that far when we're going through the process. But also with very old content like this, our print that we scanned, not great quality compared to the US, you can only push it so far, and then you start to lose detail. The blacks start to look a bit funny. It starts to not look at all like what the original should look like. After that, we put the tints and tones in digitally. So we have to match those colours, and with the new technology on the software that the post-production house, we work with Vandal on this project, use, you can match it in one place in the film, and then it will go through and identify the other places and put that same... So you're not constantly having to find that colour. It does it throughout the film for you.
It's extraordinary technology, and the results are quite amazing. I thought expressions on faces were the thing that really came out, that when they do those close-up shots, you can really see the expressions on the faces. Probably much better than people could when the film came out 100 years ago in the cinema.
Well, the nitrate actually has that level of detail in it. Our print that we scanned didn't, but things that stood out for me was detail in bricks in the background and detail in the horses' manes, and as well as the faces. You know, it's the little things that you don't even notice until it's been graded.
So the film's been upgraded, enhanced. We've got this new version of it now. Where are people going to be able to see it?
So it's screening at the Westpac Open Air Cinema with a live performance by Paul Mack, who's been engaged to write a score.
Let's talk a little bit about that, because the music was I love this about the silent film era. The music was a completely separate yet crucial element.
Absolutely.
The music performed live while the movie was playing, like a combination of a movie and a concert at the same time. Tell us about Paul Mack and what's going to happen with the score.
Yeah, so even though the film is silent, the experience of the film is not. So you wouldn't ever see the film without an accompaniment of some sort. So for this iteration of the film, we wanted to find somebody that was not traditionally associated with silent film, somebody that might bring a new perspective to the film, somebody that was contemporary but who also had an understanding and a connection with the sort of experience that we were trying to create. Westpac Open Air, when we pitched the film to them, they thought, fantastic, we'd love to be part of that. It's not what they usually do. And when we suggested that Paul Mack might be somebody that would be interested in doing the music, you know, they were particularly interested in having that. Paul is an electronica composer, musician, performer, artist. And with this film, when he saw it, he had a bit of a different response to it. And he tells the story about he's got an upright piano in his kitchen, as you do, that one morning he was in the kitchen and he was thinking about the film and he heard a theme for Bill, the bloke in the film, and he built it from there. So he's used mainly a woodwind bass for his composition. It's 100 minutes of music, because it's not like a film you might see these days where there's dialogue or sound effects supporting the dialogue, or even no music at all. He's done 100 minutes end to end of music, which is enormous, and it's you can identify the themes coming through with the different characters. He's got a real sensibility. There's a bit of a scene there with Bill and the cops, which is a little bit Keystone Cop-ish, and he gets all of that within the film. So he's done the score. He's mixing it at the moment. He will perform live with an ensemble of musicians at Westpac Open Air on the 15th of February, and the score will then be on the DCP. So we'll have 2 DCPs, the digital cinema package, one silent, one with his score. And in the future, if people would like Paul to come and do a live performance, I'm sure he'd be open to it.
Is the film going to be distributed Australia-wide, or is it only going to be at the Open Air Cinema?
We do have a couple of other screenings locked in. So there's one happening up at Penrith in June with a separate composition. There's also an international UK premiere at Falkirk at Hipfest, which is the silent film festival in Scotland. They're working with an Australian composer based in London for that premiere. And we're in negotiations for other screenings as well. But with all the NFSA restores content, we've got 30 films now that we've digitally restored. It's available through us if people want to screen it, or with score, without score. Oh, and there's a screening in Canberra as well, because we have a cinema in Canberra called ARC, and it'll be on there in April.
Elena, why is it important that we go back and restore these old films? And I mean, in this day and age of electronics and social media and people moving at the speed of light, why do we even care about these old movies? Why are they important?
For me, I think it's really important to be able to see a film as it's meant to be seen, with not on YouTube that's, 7 generations from the original, that is not great quality in either picture or audio. It's a sense of culture. I have a daughter, and it's important for her, I think, to see that we have a history, an audiovisual history. And I think it influences people's perspective of who they are and how we are in the contemporary world, as well as how we were back then. But without something like the National Film and Sound Archive, we have vaults down in Canberra, humidity controlled, temperature controlled. There's documents, there's artefacts, there's photos, audio, sound recordings, broadcast material. All of that would be lost if we didn't exist. And we have to maintain that sense of history and heritage and Australian culture, where we've come from.
And what's it like for you personally to be working in an environment where you're constantly exposed to these treasures from the past?
I feel, as you mentioned earlier, I feel very honoured to be a part of this, and I feel that the NFSA Restores program in particular is a really important one and enables me to be a part of history in a way, indirectly, because the other thing about the restorations, not with the bloke but with more contemporary ones, is we get to work with the creative teams as well. So, we can work with Bruce Beresford and Sue Milliken in Dion Beebe and, Bridget Icke and, all these filmmakers who have a very strong filmmaking history in Australia, to bring back their original vision for a film, and that is amazing. And then to show it to an audience. We did a documentary called Rocking the Foundations, which is about the union movement. Pat Fisk made that. And seeing that with a very young audience was incredible. They just had no clue about the history of the union movement, and particularly in today's society where unions are a bit different to how they have been in the past. There was a standing ovation at the end of the screening because it clicked. They kind of got it, and I'm not saying without the restoration program, but without the NFSA, some of those connections just couldn't be made.
Well, it's really wonderful work you're doing, not just on the Sentimental Bloke, but on all the material you have here in the archives. It's really wonderful that it's being brought again to an audience, and new audiences are able to accept it. And I'd say to everyone who's listening, go and see the Sentimental Bloke. If you have the opportunity at the Open Air Cinema or one of the other screenings, go and check it out, because, as I said, I've seen it, and it's a window to the past. It's really a really wonderful thing. So, Elena, thank you so much for joining us to talk about the Sentimental Bloke.
You're welcome. Thank you.